Hi everyone, this is Fiona Paulo. I've been an artist/commentator on this particular platform for about 4 years now, as of this month. Before that, I considered myself an artist since I was about 16 to 17, which is when I decided to pursue art professionally after high school. And before that, I believed I had depression since before becoming a teenager. And I'm not the only one. We're all probably very well aware that mental health is now being talked about more than ever before, which is absolutely a positive thing. However, what also comes with that is the, quite frankly, startling realization of just how many people suffer from mental health issues in the general population. According to an article published by Forth with Life looking into mental health in the UK in 2024 in particular, more than 1 in 7 UK adults say their mental health is currently either bad or the worst it's ever been. 18.5% of women and 12.5% of men are struggling with poor mental health. Young people aged 16 to 24 are noted as being the most affected by mental health struggles, with nearly 23.5% describing their mental health as either bad or the worst it's ever been. In the UK in 2024, the term "how to reduce stress" is searched on Google once every 10 minutes on average. These are only a small selection of the findings from that particular article, but it paints a pretty dire picture of how bad things are currently in my country alone. And from what I've read in books, seen on television, listened to online, and heard directly from friends, it's a similar story in most other countries as well. There are honestly a metric ton of reasons as to why this is the case, and I could quite literally sit here for hours just listing them out and going through them on their own, but there's a very specific demographic I wanted to look into today, of whom the concept of poor mental health has not only made its way into the public subconscious, but has more or less made itself into a collective stereotype. The caricature of the struggling or tortured artist is not a new revelation. For as long as people have dedicated themselves to expressing their innermost feelings, desires, and secrets in a creative way, suffering, be it physically or mentally, has often been suspected and even revered as the secret ingredient to what makes certain artists, such as Vincent van Gogh or Georgia O'Keeffe, so prolific in a landscape of the creative mind. After all, you can't always accurately depict what you've never known, and one can't expect to illustrate grandiose machinations of the spectrum of human emotion without experiencing them firsthand, or at the very least, having the ability to heavily empathize with them. Despite that though, it's been more or less proven time and again that despite experiencing intense emotions, artists actually tend to create their best works when their mental health is on the mend, as opposed to being in the throes of despair. And not only that, being adept at creating art doesn't always have to mean you suffered to do so. Yet in the digital age, it's becoming apparent that making art itself and feeling like you have to create something consistently no matter what is contributing to the ever-distressing mental health statistics, to the point where we have an ever-increasing number of creative people of all ages and backgrounds struggling with mental health and feeling like they're fighting an uphill battle. Creative industries are being erased by the advancement of AI technology. Large corporations are conducting mass layoffs on what feels like an almost weekly basis in sectors like animation or illustration, and creatives are constantly fighting against accusations of relevance in order to retain even a modicum of respect within the modern world. And it's not even just professional spaces, even hobby spaces feel less welcoming to artists than they used to be depending on the circumstances. All it takes is one idiot deciding to stick your piece into a cringe compilation or sharing your work to another platform with the intention of mockery, and suddenly you're facing a slew of online vitriol directed at the one thing that was supposed to be a distraction from such issues. So when you consider all of that happening at the same time, if you are already experiencing mental health struggles, what in the actual hell would possess you to pursue a creative passion? Why would you continue to do so when the world and even your own body and mind is seemingly against you doing so? Well, that, my friends, is the question I seek to answer today. And from what I've looked into and theorized in this video, the potential reasons for it run deeper than we might initially think. I've also experienced my own slew of mental health issues from a young age, hence why this intrigues me so much. I've known I've had depression since before high school, and it's also likely I experienced seasonal affective disorder, which ain't fun in the land of grey skies and never-ending drizzle, let me tell you. And I've also gone through my own issues of my creative career being killed off before it even had a chance to begin through no fault of my own, and yet despite that, I still want to make art. Art still makes me happy, but for the life of me, I could never quite understand why, despite the fact that it oftentimes felt so intricately tied to my more negative feelings or past circumstances. So this video is essentially me trying to look into that and maybe help others to understand their own cranial machinations behind that too. I'll be looking through a pretty hefty amount of research, including the results found in a survey I conducted in order to paint a picture for you. Thank you, by the way, to the 225 people who took part in that. I really appreciate you all being involved in this, and I hope you not only find the overall results interesting, but that it allows you to reflect on your own relationship with mental health, creative pursuits, and how exactly they work together. Please also just remember that any theoreticals shared in this video are my own unless stated otherwise, and I am not a mental health expert or a doctor, I'm just an artist. So nothing I say should be taken as gospel. And while I'm happy for people to share their own experiences and ideas relating to the topic at hand, please take care not to get too comfortable with things such as disclosing your own entire mental health history in the comments. And if you feel that you experience any severe mental health concerns and haven't already, then I very much encourage you to consider seeking help from a medical professional. That aside, if you enjoy what I have to say in this video, then please consider liking and subscribing. I cover a lot of topics to do with creative industries, fandom behaviors, and things like that. So I'm sure you'll find something that strikes your fancy. So without further ado, let's begin. In my quest to answer this all-important dilemma of why exactly mental illness is so prevalent in creative sectors and particularly artists, I wanted to dive into the more scientific side of mental health in addition to just gathering thoughts and opinions, which of course hold their own merit, but I did come across a good many resources to do with the associated topics, such as books on specific mental illnesses or articles on mental health rates and percentages in certain creative areas, and while they provided a lot of useful information as to current trends in areas requiring a substantial amount of overhaul and other such adjacent material, here's my issue. None of them were really providing the specific answer I was looking for. To give people some background as to the information I was coming across, the majority of it revolved around the effects on mental health that end up becoming associated with certain creative industries or fields after going into them. I've already looked into a couple of these industries in the past when talking about the current or ongoing situations in them, such as the animation and webcomics industry. Webcomics in particular happen to be an absolute minefield when it comes to having a negative impact on the mental health of the artists who partake in it, mainly due to excessive working hours, minimal financial compensation, tight deadlines, and just an uncompromising reception both from fans and those higher up in the production food chain. Animation honestly isn't much different either, to the point where there has been an increasing amount of protests, demonstrations, and picket lines taking place in prominent areas where creative industries are based, such as Burbank in California. But we already know that the current conditions faced by the people in these industries are testing, and it doesn't exactly explain why these rates of mental illness are so high and so prevalent in the hobby spaces as well. And a lot of these hobbyists weren't people in the workforce. A large percentage of those people creating and posting art online as a hobby are younger people under the age of 18. Essentially, what I was trying to find out specifically was whether there might be any kind of neurobiological reasonings as to why people chose creative pursuits. Mostly because the creation of art helps with the release of dopamine in our systems, which is known as the feel-good chemical that gives us feelings of happiness and satisfaction. The reason I bring this up is because it's worth noting that people with mental health issues often experience a dopamine deficiency, meaning we don't produce it as often as a mentally stable individual, and this often results in the more volatile aspects of certain behaviors that are commonly associated with mental illness, such as memory loss, lack of motivation, and mood swings. One article I came across did in fact take a look into the connection between creativity and anxiety, while also linking it to how children who are creatively inclined can be at higher risk of developing anxiety disorders as they get older. In the article, Understanding the Fascinating Link Between Anxiety and Creativity, published on parent.com, a 2004 survey by psychologist Erika Laurinen in Finland found that of 13 published studies, all but one supported a connection between mental illness and creativity. A 2015 study published in the journal Nature Neuroscience found that genetic factors that raise the risk of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia are found more often in people in creative professions. Painters, musicians, writers, and dancers were, on average, 25% more likely to carry the gene than less creative professionals like farmers, manual laborers, and salespeople. The scientists point out that to be creative, people need to think differently, and this may be genetic. The main reason for the connection between anxiety and creativity is imagination. The dichotomy lies in the fact that the same brain that conjures up inventive paintings, poetry, and music can also get trapped in repetitive thoughts and dreadful worries. Just to reiterate, what I was coming across in most of this material was that any studies, theories, and think pieces specifically related to the creative industry were kind of reinforcing the idea that these issues begin manifesting when people are entering the workforce. But the resources I found when looking into general mental health, no matter your line of work, indicated that these issues begin arising much earlier in life for most of the population. And it is worth noting that younger artists do tend to be more open about their mental state than older ones due to a variety of factors as well. But according to a 2020 survey carried out by the NHS, 1 in 6 young people in England aged 5 to 16 experienced a mental health problem in 2020, up from 1 in 1.9 in 2017. That's already more young people experiencing mental health struggles a couple of years ago than adults in our initial statistic at the beginning of this year. And running parallel with that, the accessibility of artistic development afforded by digital resources such as online references, digital drawing programs for PCs, mobiles and iPads, and a near endless supply of learning material ensures that young people have a relatively low barrier of entry into the art world in a space, the internet, which they already frequent and are constantly exposed to. When you put those things together, it's actually pretty understandable that droves of young people following COVID use drawing as an outlet for how they're feeling, whether it be drawing, writing, or otherwise creating it themselves, watching other people create, or engaging and just feeling like a part of the overall artistic conversation. I mean, I'm already an example of that last part. I'm fully aware that probably around 80% of you don't watch my videos and are likely only listening to my voice as you draw yourself. That's not a call out, by the way, because I do it too. Speaking of which, what animal did I just flash up on the screen? Leave a comment. But with that being the case, I began to suspect that this whole predicament has much more to do with the developmental and evolutionary mechanics of a young person's brain than I might have initially thought, and how this particular group might respond when mental health comes into the equation alongside such readily accessible pastime, and how they might look back on both of these factors at a future point in time. One thing that I personally came back to a lot when concerning the trifecta of my own mental health struggles, the drive to create art, and the unfortunate demise of my professional prospects in the creative field is the concept of regret when choosing what I wanted to do in college. Why on earth did I choose to do this knowing that this was always a likely outcome? That I was going to be doing art as a side hobby / hustle and working a day job anyway. And this is something that a lot of people tend to dwell on when things don't go well as creative prospects go. But the more I thought about it, the more I kept turning around in my head the notion of how people insist on teenagers specifically only caring about getting through the current day and worrying about the important stuff, such as big life decisions, at a later point. I often catch myself thinking this way too now that I'm an adult, but I still remember being a teenager and feeling so overwhelmed and scrutinized and honestly placed under a microscope when it came to people asking me what I wanted to do for my future. I didn't know. I just wanted to draw anime and for people to stop pressuring me all the goddamn time. And I'm pretty sure that that definitely hasn't changed in the last 10 years. Oh god, I've been out of school for 10 years. Trying to bring all of those thoughts together and wrestling with them was when I came across a really interesting book in my local library called 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People by Dr. David Yeager that looks to understand the neurobiological behavior of people aged between, well, 10 to 25, and asserts the idea that these age groups share a lot more mental similarities than we might think. And a lot of those have to do with how the adolescent brain prioritizes certain motivations and rewards. One bit of terminology that really caught my attention, which is referenced pretty much throughout the entire book, is the concept of the wise feedback model. Basically, the way a typical adult provides information or feedback to a person aged between 10 to 25 is very, very ineffective. According to several studies referenced in Yeager's book, failed attempts to motivate and influence young people, like the Think Don't Smoke campaign or the conventional patient education approach in most transplant clinics, come from what I call the neurobiological incompetence model. According to this model, a young person is a flawed and deficient thinker who can't comprehend the future consequences of their actions. Thus, young people need to be told what to think and do repeatedly by adults who know better. Basically, the way that adolescent and adult brains process information is very different. Teenage brains are more so focused on social hierarchy and a sense of belonging compared to adult brains. Speaking in an evolutionary sense, back when we were all still cavemen, the need to be seen as both useful and worth respecting influenced whether or not you were allowed to stay within your allotted group, increasing your chances of both survival and the chance to reproduce, lest you be outcasted, leading to diminished resources and eventual death. The wise feedback model referenced is a method of reassurance to young people that you can see their efforts and current skill on display, that those efforts are appreciated, and thus are providing the feedback you are giving because you think they are capable of applying it in the way that will best allow them to keep moving forward and, more importantly, prove themselves to be both useful and worthy of respect. I don't know about you, but personally, I think the culture surrounding young people making art and being encouraged to keep improving at something that brings them joy is a huge hallmark of this wise feedback model. Being told that your efforts are acknowledged and receiving positive reinforcement alongside your own sense of achievement in creating something often contributes to a rush of dopamine in the brain, and since dopamine is less frequent in the brains of people with mental health issues, that subsequently means that the rush of happiness you feel is that much more powerful. When you bring all of this together, the conclusion almost feels ridiculously simple. What I think is happening is that young people's brains are rerouting this need for both dopamine required for their mental health and social reward, which is wired into our primal survival instincts, into not just creating artwork, work, but showcasing it online due to the higher likelihood of receiving praise for their efforts and feeling like they are being accepted into a group where they are socially respected. And then because of this, depending on a variety of other factors of course, I think this also contributes to a significant number of artists' willingness to pursue creative careers later on in life as well. But of course, we can talk about the science side of things all we want, but I also wanted to weigh this up against the opinions expressed by actual professional and hobbyist artists themselves. And to do so, I went and conducted my own form of research. So, like I mentioned earlier, I actually went ahead and put together a survey in order to gauge the general consensus of what people thought of this within my own circle. The aim of my survey was to try and establish a link between mental health and art, and to encourage people to reflect on their own relationships with the two. I ended up receiving about 225 responses, which is crazy, honestly, so again, thank you to everyone who took part. I did my best to go through them earnestly, and even did so with a couple of my patrons on Discord. We all ended up having a really chill but very productive discussion overall. And honestly, it felt good to start connecting with people again after kind of being a little bit of a hermit. That said, I feel I should put out that, again, I am not a mental health expert, I am not a doctor or a researcher, this is just something I do for fun, and as a result, the survey wasn't perfect. I did receive feedback from an individual on the phrasing of the questions and was informed that the questions were very leading, which means that many of them were asked as a way of asserting certain statements and likely led to more biased results because of it, which I do apologize for. In future, I'll try to phrase questions in a more neutral way. For example, instead of "do you think creative industries are more welcoming to people with mental health?" Maybe try rephrasing it as "how welcoming are the creative industries to people with mental health issues?" Thank you again to the individual who pointed that out. Another potential thing to improve on in future was that no demographics were recorded, such as how many people who took part were of a certain race, sexuality, nationality, and other factors to that effect. And to be honest, that was intentional, as mental illness can affect quite literally anyone regardless of those things. But I do understand that those factors can skew the results somewhat. As well as that, the results were also very concentrated within my own sphere of influence, meaning not only did these results mostly pertain to digital artists and less so towards traditional or craft persons, this can also mean that people might be inclined to give answers they think I want to hear as opposed to their own opinions. Even despite that though, these are the answers we have, and I do trust that a good handful of the 200 plus people who answered were as earnest as they could be, which again, thank you. I'll be going through each question one by one, showing the results of questions that were collected through percentages on screen, and reading out a selection of written responses, of which I can only do a handful, but I'll be going over why I asked them, what the overall results were, any notable responses, and other such things like that to the best of my ability. So with our first question, have you ever experienced at least one of the following mental illnesses? Out of the 220 responses, 191 or 86.8% said they have anxiety, 161 or 73.2% have depression, and 47 or 21.4% have post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. This pretty much lined up with what I suspected when it comes to both art and mental health, especially considering depression and anxiety tend to be the two most common mental health issues overall in the general population from what I've seen. However, what did surprise me was that while I knew there would be a substantial number of written-in responses since there were only so many specific illnesses I could put in, I was surprised at how many mentioned they were undiagnosed. And in retrospect, I probably should have added a few more answers than what I did to account for that specifically, but in the moment I also didn't want to overload people with too many options. Again, that is a flaw of me not being a researcher. I did also have a few people stating that they didn't feel like they could partake in the survey if they don't have a mental health issue currently, which I do just want to mention. Those issues can hit you at any point in your life and can also be heavily dependent on a variety of factors, and you don't have to have necessarily suffered all your life or be suffering from them right that second to have experienced certain symptoms and draw from them. I did also appreciate that a few people mentioned these variables in their responses, but just for your own peace of mind, if you have experience with mental illness but are not currently in the throes of it, that's okay. I think that's also probably something worth looking into as well, how having a mental illness can be seen as a requirement into some kind of exclusive circle sometimes. This was a big thing with subcultures like emo music back in the 2000s, and it most definitely should not be seen that way, nor should it be making a comeback. mental illness is not a trend, much less an aspiration. Let's not go back to those times, they were not fun. Moving on, when asked, was art seen or used as a way to mitigate symptoms of the above disorders, out of 222 responses, 121 or 54.5% said yes, 78 or 35.1% said maybe, and 25 or 10.4% said no. And this was asked to try and get a feel for just how many people actively drew art with the idea in mind that it aided with mental health, since we all know that poor mental health can arise from any such causes. Honestly, I kind of expected a larger pool of people to say yes rather than being on the fence. However, this may be a bias towards established coping mechanisms. There is also the chance that many people, men in particular, tend to downplay or underreport their struggles, even when partaking in things like this due to cultural misconceptions around perceived weaknesses. Another interesting tidbit with this is that therapy also lends itself to the idea that art helps with mental health sufferers, as things like art therapy are in fact used as a way of coaxing patients into using other forms of expression as a method of communication. According to a set of statistics shown on crowncounseling.com, studies show that art therapy helps in reducing symptoms of anxiety, depression, and stress by 73%, especially amongst children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder or ASD. 77% of the people who took these sessions reported improved overall psychological health and communication and social skills. This question also somewhat worked in tandem with the next one along. Did it work? Out of 211 responses, on a scale from 1, didn't work at all, to 10, worked extremely well, 56 or 26.5% answered 7, 43 or 20.4% answered 6, and 41 or 19.4% answered 8. So it's safe to say that most people generally believe that, yes, creating something as an outlet is believed to, at the very least, temporarily improve things like low mood. The reason I asked these two together is because in the context of things like doing art for a hobby versus a living, this can in fact have an effect on whether people feel a sense of accomplishment or reward from creating something. Sometimes they do. It's always nice to know you did something well at work or in your personal time, but there's also a risk of it becoming a grind. You know, I can attest to that. It's draining sometimes to have to consistently think of what art to put out there. Maybe not as much as someone who relies on it for a living, but still. And that's not to say either that going into art as a profession or for monetary gain is guaranteed to suck the joy out of you. That's not what I'm saying, but it is significantly more likely for someone to struggle with mental health more intensely, say if they're experiencing a period of burnout but can't afford to stop. This is also something we'll be looking into in a later question, so we'll come back to that. When asked, do you feel that your mental health played a part in the decision to pursue art either as a profession or a hobby? Out of 223 responses, and on a scale of 1, definitely not, to 5, definitely, 60 or 26.9% answered 3, 50 or 22.4% answered 4, and 49, 22% exactly, answered 5. So we can see that the majority said that it did, which is very interesting because that begs a whole slew of other potential questions. In what context is that the case? How far back does that motivation go? But it's also something to note that the highest percentage of all 5 options, people actually said they were on the fence between whether it did or not. I think I'm starting to notice a pattern of people feeling quite self-assured in the initial answers until we start to dig a little bit under the surface as to where that desire to pursue art actually manifested, which again is why I'm so keen to actually dig into it. It could be nothing, mind you, but it could also be something that people who gave these answers may find incredibly useful in deciphering their own motivations further than they might have already. Following on from that, if given the choice to start over, would you have pursued art if your mental health was better? Out of 219 responses, 150 or 68.5% said yes, 56 or 25.6% said maybe, and 13 or 5.9% said no. This was more or less what I expected to see, though I do wonder if the bulk of these answers are due in part to art possibly being the only thing artists have known, and they can't imagine doing anything else. When it comes to mental illness in particular, I don't think people are strangers to the concept of both tunnel vision and spiraling. And when I say this, what I mean is that when it comes to certain mental health issues, such as depression and anxiety in particular, but it is common in others as well, it's a lot easier to spiral and consider every which way that something could go wrong, and subsequently develop the mentality that it's easier to stick to what you know and not take the risk of branching out only for it to end badly and put you in a worse position than you are now. Do I think everyone filling out this survey was answering with that particular explanation being at the forefront? Absolutely not. But maybe it could be something to chew on. I'm not exactly trying to put ideas in people's heads about their own decisions, by the way. This is all meant to be for speculation and reflection. Anyway, this is where we start to get into the more individualistic responses rather than me speculating anyway. So moving on, do you think think creative industries are more welcoming to people with mental health issues? Out of 209 responses on a scale of 1, definitely not, to 10, definitely, 56 or 26.8% said 5, 40 or 19.1% said 3, and 23 or 11% said 1. Now, considering how hot a topic it has been for the past few years to drag big corporations online for the shitty way they exploit various industries and push workers to their limits, I think that attitude tends to stem from a more outsider and collective-oriented mindset, whereas people who have actually worked in the industry would probably be able to assert what their own experiences were like on an individual level. And I think that might be the key distinction here between why certain answers were chosen. I could be completely wrong on that, mind you, but we can only draw from the responses given, which, by the way, relating to this question, directly afterwards we ask, why do people think that is? Now, there were 181 responses to this, which I obviously can't read out here, so I chose a select few to give a general idea of the types of answers people were providing. Because companies prey on the insecurities of artists and seek to exploit them for as long as feasibly possible before moving on to the next hot commodity. In my experience, going through higher education in the creative field, the older generation of creatives are extremely unwelcoming and often hostile towards individuals with mental health struggles. I've been singled out by professors because of my own mental health and bullied/harassed by adults who hold a position of power. However, it seems that younger generations are pushing back and creating their own safe spaces, or actively trying to remove unsafe older individuals. A short time ago, I was a patient in an inpatient psychiatric hospital. I had to call my future art school because the school was in a big city and I still hadn't found an apartment. I explained my situation to the student advisory service and the advisor was very friendly towards me. She talked about how mental disorders have often come up in creative circles and that she might even be able to recommend some psychologists and therapists to help me. Coming from a self-publishing background and fanfiction writing background, I think creative communities can be welcoming, but the industry seems at least quite brutal. Moreover, the sense of competition has the potential to get unhealthy fast, given the people who are involved do often have mental health struggles and may not communicate constructively. Not because they aren't trying, but it is how it is. Just some inside knowledge for you. Apparently my cat is trying to push her paws under the shut door where I'm recording, and she's been put in her jail. Most creative industries, while seeming welcoming to people with mental health issues, typically see them as good employees to take advantage of because of how many starving artists there are and how desperate people are to do what they love no matter the detriment. People with mental health issues are seen as disposable and easy to overwork and take advantage of. So from what we can see, there were some very interesting points brought up here, including but not limited to the problem of generational divides, the idea of certain people with mental health issues either wanting to keep their heads down or being seen as more obedient, and the general cutthroat competitiveness that is prevalent in certain industries where security and decent wages are fairly disproportionate to just how many people are trying to work and stay afloat within them. All of these answers, alongside the many others provided, are of course valid. Everyone's experiences with pretty much all of these are going to be different, so I appreciate the variation. Following this, we asked a similar question of, do you think creative hobby spaces are welcoming to people with mental health issues? Again, out of 215 responses, on a scale of 1, definitely not, to 10, definitely, 54 or 25.1% said 8, 36 or 16.7% answered 7, and there was an equal split of 27 or 12.6% voting for both 5 and 10, which was interesting. So most people generally answered that hobby spaces are in fact welcoming to people with mental health issues, or at the least are more welcoming than professional spaces, which definitely lines up with expectations, since people are much more likely to be comfortable in places they voluntarily enter, though there is still potential for things like toxic fans in spaces. Unfortunately with that, no matter where you are, there will always be at least 1% of bad apples that will attempt to spoil the bunch, and the annoying thing with that is that 1% of 100,000 people, for example, still leaves you with 1,000 idiots you have to deal with. So if you are in those specific kinds of spaces, just make sure to exercise caution. When asked why do people think that is, we have a few more answers to have a look at and chew on. At times, creative spaces can be incredibly accommodating and welcoming, but others it seems like expressing symptoms of your mental illness or disorders drives a wedge between you and your peers. Something along the lines of being in a room full of not normal people but still being singled out for misbehavior if you stim too openly or can't pick up on a social cue correctly. because the general audience doesn't understand mental health issues and how they can manifest. The spaces create avenues for people to express themselves, but there's the looming possibility that it's going to be taken the wrong way by someone who doesn't understand or doesn't try to understand the nature of that expression. They are until people express their mental health issues outside of the gaze of an OO aesthetic, and actually using vent art for its intended purpose, then get wrongfully called out and dragged online for daring to have an emotional outlet for their mental health, and later get lectured on the right way of expressing mental health problems in the art community. It's a lot of policing and gatekeeping once in the thick of it. Small communities are much more inclusive simply because there's little monetary incentive. I have seen quite a few online spaces that actively demonized neurodivergent creators purely for showing symptoms, but for pure hobbyists, it's a little easier when you don't have to rely on your own brain's creative juices for the money you need to live. Depends on the hobby and its community. Model craft can have some toxic as hell communities that can be hostile and mentally taxing, but then some groups are really kind of welcoming, based on observing my boyfriend's mental health struggles and the Warhammer 40k community. My creative experience of creative hobby spaces is a knitting and crochet group in a dedicated mental health cafe, so this is obviously welcoming to those with mental health conditions. However, I feel like creative hobby spaces kind of lend themselves to supporting those with mental health conditions. They are a relaxed space in which to work on your projects and talk to other people, but with no pressure to talk if you don't want to. Again, there is quite a lot of room for some introspection with these, and something I and my patrons spoke about as well when looking into the survey was that while fan spaces can generally be more accepting of mental health compared to other spaces, the second a person in the space, or hell, even a character a collective group enjoys, exhibits symptoms that they either don't understand or aren't familiar with, people are very quick to turn around on them. And this very much highlights the attitudes towards people with more intensive mental health struggles. We'll accept you, but only if you're one of the good ones. It's like that whole stereotype of people only tolerating shy, cutesy, depressed people, but not depressed people who bed rot. On the subject of vent art as well, that's a tricky one, and I had a lengthy chat about this because to an extent, I personally believe that vent art can be very impactful and helpful with alleviating some of the darker thoughts and even impulses. But also that being so open about it online can be to a person's detriment because the wrong type of people can and will try to use it against them, which is honestly my main concern with that. Anything can technically be vent art, but the second the wrong person twigs on to when something is, it can be awful. So if you do post vent art, this isn't to discourage you, but I would advise caution about how much of it you post and where you post it. Following on from that, when asked, has creating art ever negatively impacted your mental health as opposed to helping it, out of 222 responses, 90 or 40.5% said yes, 74 or 33.3% said no, and 58, 26.1% said maybe. Now, this one really stands in contrast compared to our previous ones towards the beginning where people mentioned that creating art helped with their mental health. And yet, here, over a third of people are also saying that making art has also negatively impacted them. Though what I will say about this one is that this may be less to do with creating the art itself and more so the culture surrounding it, some of the most prominent factors likely being the supposed perfectionism of social media, the pressure to create consistently, and the desire to reach a specific result very quickly. All of this feels pretty counterintuitive to the actual art making process when you really sit down and think about it, and this is corroborated by our follow-up question: if yes, how so? When I was younger, I was very much a perfectionist when it came to drawing, and could get extremely stressed and upset if a drawing wasn't going exactly how I wanted it to. I'm a lot more relaxed when it comes to art now, but I still catch those negative emotions coming back sometimes, and can be very down on myself about a drawing that actually looks really good if I step away and look at it again later. I also find myself comparing myself to others, not so much in terms of how good the art is, but if I can see their art improving over a much faster period of time than mine is. It's more so the aftermath of creating art, because after working so hard on a piece and thinking you've made improvements to your style, it gets little to no traction online, or people just give it the same compliment as all your other pieces with no thought. This shouldn't be a factor in creating art, but I think every artist would be lying if they didn't admit to wanting to see their work seen and at least talked about in some way, shape or form. Lately, I've felt slumped when it comes to producing art. Lately, people have been asking for commissions that contain a subject matter that isn't my area of expertise, and it negatively affected my Patreon and made me wonder what kind of artist people want me to be. Am I destined to find success making art that I want to do? Or is it safer to make a living drawing things I don't want to? Needless to say, I'm still looking for the answer. I feel pressured by social media to post. I feel pressured by myself to improve, or if I'm doing drawings that are meant to go together or match. I feel pressured to make them both the same size or quality, which can be hard. I feel pressured by family and friends to share my art with them, even if I don't feel like it, and they get upset when I say no. I often find myself stuck in this horrible art block that won't really go away. It's pretty common and has followed me basically basically my whole art career. When I get in a bad headspace, art does not make me feel better, it makes me feel worse. When in this headspace, I view my art unfairly and overly negatively. I get stuck in a loop of telling myself I'll never get better, so why am I even trying? A lot of the answers given for this one that I could see were less focused on making the art itself and instead looked at the reception of it when put forth to others, or drawing comparisons, or trying to get to a certain skill level and more or less speedrunning into burnout. And whether it be due to the way I asked the question or what, this really feels like quite the switch up compared to before, and some of that likely has to do with how people have now had some time to look inward and be a bit more introspective with their answers. And unfortunately, with mental health issues, this can often result in more pessimistic outlooks than anything else. It almost feels like the classic case of the overthinker dilemma. I do also just want to point out that it is okay to feel your feelings. Like, there's nothing wrong with being a little bit pessimistic and feeling a bit down about your art or what you do or how it's received. That's normal, it's human nature, but just don't let yourself run away with it. But moving on, our next question is, what are your thoughts on the notion and perception of the tortured artist? Do you think artists should have to suffer to be deemed truly creative? Depth of understanding comes from the pain and trials one has gone through in their life. However, that suffering does not inherently make one's art better. If anything, suffering, pain, and mental discord gets in the way of creating for many people out there. I do think that the worldliness that suffering, whether mentally or at the hands of those around you, brings can influence someone into ways of making art that has a harder bite or even brighter luster, but that worldliness can be gained in ways that don't have to do with wanting to die because my body is broken, or having to sob on the floor because my brain won't work how it seems like everyone else's does. I think people can find inspiration from a lot of sources, sure. Suffering could be one of them, but creativity is something you train. If you find yourself imagining over and over again, you'll surely begin to create more complex stories and ideas in your mind. Also, we all have problems in our lives. Even if someone feels like their problems are lesser than someone else's, they still have stuff they've gone through. So if suffering was 100% needed to be a creative, I'd still think that we can all become a creative person. Positively creative art can inspire people just as much, but a tortured artist tends to have more extreme life experiences to draw from, and people can take solace in understanding that others have suffered and that they are not alone in their struggles. The tortured artist notion does have some nuance to it. Suffering in general has the right to be expressed in art, but I personally think you don't have to suffer to create good art. Since it's subjective, it can come from any place, whether through suffering or a genuinely good silver spoon-fed life, or anything in between. All of these can be expressed through art. It will be different, but that's my fave part of it all, honestly. I hate that idea. Art is something I do for fun, and all that my suffering has done to me is prevent me from making more art. When my mental health is in a bad spot, it makes it so much harder to pick up a pen. It's when I feel happy, self-assured, and safe that I make the kind of art I'm proud of. Learning healthy coping mechanisms and getting treated for my conditions has done wonders to my art journey. I'll be honest, I think going through these answers in particular may have restored my faith in humanity a bit. From what I could glean from this one, the general consensus is no, people should not have to suffer to be considered an artist, nor should that have any bearing on how their art is perceived, whether it be good or bad. But having gone through certain experiences can give artists the capacity to approach broader subject matters within their works with more confidence. What I often notice with myself, and it's also something I've seen with others as well, is that when you struggle with mental health, you're pretty damn aware of the way in which you view yourself. You know that you're being too hard on yourself, you know the words in your head shouldn't be that vicious, but those thoughts and feelings are ridiculously hard to ignore. But if someone else was feeling that same way, all of a sudden you feel this massive rush of empathy for them because no one else should feel that way about themselves. And that same mentality can apply to artists. Makes you think, doesn't it? And for our final question, I wanted to give people a space to just put out any remaining thoughts and reflections on their overall feelings towards what they create. So I asked, why do you create art? I make art because it makes me happy. I love the act of creating something. I love seeing people I care about and even strangers smile because of something I made. I love seeing the torment and terror other people experience when they read my horror writings. I love seeing the way other people like me can find kinship in my monsters and their deformities. I love hearing how something I wrote or drew made someone cry or made them laugh or made them kick their feet in frustration. I make art because I love being able to connect with others through something I created with my own two hands. Art is the first and only thing that I can do without being wrong or incorrect when doing so. It gives me freedom to explore and express, and gives me another way of communicating that isn't verbal, as a way to cope with life, to do as a hobby while working a regular job, from inspiration from past creative works and other artists, and to inspire others in the future. I'm currently working on a webcomic since my original goal of becoming an animator as a career didn't work out, and I'm not the only one who's felt that disappointment, and becoming an indie comic artist has allowed me to create whatever I want. within reason, of course. I like to spend time creating things related to characters I love, such as edits or fan arts. I like taking my slow time to make things with a lot of passion and love for detail. I also like to distract myself from my real life when things get bad. I also like to incorporate headcanons in my art or like to imagine characters in specific settings and enjoy going from an imagination to a picture, because no one else will make what I like for myself. What I find really fascinating about all of this is that it's not only indicative of the creative industry, but the same logic can be applied in so many other places, not just to do with careers or hobby spaces, but also in social circles. But I will say that while this is a truly interesting look into how the brain works, it also goes a bit of the way into explaining why so many people become so susceptible to less than favorable circumstances as well. Looking at it under a more sinister lens, this is likely why younger people, even ones considered pretty smart, often fall victim to untoward or predatory interactions online, for example, because the wise feedback model will often be employed, and these people who are seeking respect and encouragement flock to whatever source of that they can find. And this can become especially concerning when mental illness is thrown into the mix, and the release of dopamine can be even stronger and potentially more addicting. On a less sinister note, I can definitely attest to the idea of mental health and this wise feedback model having a large influence on my own decision to pursue animation, because I wasn't exactly given much direction anywhere else in regards to what teachers or authoritative figures thought I was good at and thought I should pursue. Art was pretty much the only thing where people actively told me I was doing well and to continue with it, so logically I did. I did art for my exams, got a bachelor's, and then a master's. It was only after COVID and I finally approached my mid-20s when it sunk in that I probably would have preferred to pursue something with a bit more financial stability, and the precariousness of work in the creative sectors was in opposition to my craving for that, and so here I am. Even now though, after having done all that reading and understanding in regards to all these different neurobiological behaviors and functions that may well have led me to the choices I made, I still can't bring myself to regret it. Art still makes me happy. The fact of the matter is that I want to keep doing it, and I do want you all to know that if that is also the choice you make for yourselves, you should absolutely try to make it as far as you are willing to go. With that said though, I hope that what I talked about today gives you the opportunity to reflect on your own relationships with both art and mental health. Personally, I think that while it's always good to do something you enjoy, it's also potentially beneficial to look back at why you think that's the case and to evaluate it in both the short and long term. In any case, thank you so much for watching, and if you like this video then please consider liking and subscribing. I've been a little down the past few months, not really knowing what to do, how to move forward, and other things like that, but I often find that that tends to be when I end up getting super introspective when it comes to these aspects of the art world or fandom spaces or something similar. So what else is there to do besides follow that and see where it leads, you know? Was this video basically a long-winded way of saying that online art spaces do more to motivate young people to try their best and to do what makes them happy than a lot of others do? Absolutely, but hey, at least I had fun pretending to be a psychologist for a little while. And as long as you all enjoyed it too, then that's what makes it all the more worthwhile as well. Again, please be sure to take care regarding what you choose to share in the comments, and if you feel that you experience any severe mental health concerns and haven't already, please consider seeking help from a medical professional. I will provide a few links to some mental health resources below, including the readings and articles I looked into for this topic. Also, an immensely huge thank you to my patrons, a few of whom kept me company when looking through some of the survey results, as a way to give you guys some insight as to how I conduct research into some of my video topics. Thank you to my YouTube peeps, Jesse Sparks, Manuel Legzom Gonzalez, Ash Valentine, Lauren R, Mystic Mind, and Pedantic Hat. And an extra special thank you to my indie production supporters Morgan LeFay DeThin, Matty A, Kiyoshi, Roundcat, and Inside Chaos. If you'd like to become a patron, a link to my page will be down below. Stay safe everyone, and I will speak to you in the next one. Bye!